All right, we're here with Jose Pontes, king of global EV sales reports, especially the major markets of China, Europe, and well, a bunch of European markets, but globally as well. And Steve Hanley and Larry Evans of Clean Technica. We are enthusiastically talking about our expectations for EV sales in three major markets next year and in 2030. And those markets are China, which we just did a video on. Make sure to watch that if you haven't yet, and to like and subscribe and hype it and all that stuff. And now we're going to talk about the European EV market, what's been going on the past year or two, and what we expect from 2026 and 2030. Of course, there's a whole different dynamic than what's happening in China. All these markets are very unique. Um, I was once told never to say very unique. It's either unique or not unique. There's no very, but not really sure if I agree with that. But we're going to say each of these markets are unique, I guess. But yeah, Jose, tell us where we were in 2024, where we are in 2025, and then you can just jump into what you expect for 2026, and then we'll get Steve, Larry, and me to chime in with our thoughts.
Mhm. So this year we are at 18% for BEVs year to date, and PHEVs are at 9%, which gives total of plugins 27. Last year we were a little bit below, so around 15% for BEVs. So what we're seeing is that the growth rate is around 25%, which is pretty good. And I think there will be perspectives of increasing this market share for the future, at least for the next 2 years, like reaching 35, maybe 40%, which mean that for next year, we should see reach the BEV share around, I would say, 25, 27%, and then plugins in total around 35.
So you think it will go from 18% this year to 25, 27% next year?
Yeah, 25, I would say. Yeah,
And then
because
plugins
yeah, and
overall
then plugins also
would go
from 9% to, I would say, 13. Of course, I think for the next 2 years, it will be relatively easy to forecast. From then onwards, it will depend on a lot of factors. But assuming those factors stay as they are, I think the 2035 target of having 100% BV rate is feasible, although it won't be easy. There will be more support to the industry needed. And one of the things that we are talking in Europe is to have cheaper, small BEVs with less, let's say, aid nannies to make it cheaper to produce and therefore to sell it. So I think it will be in December that the e-car project will be revealed. And there it's a sort of a K-car category for Europe, where it will be small cars, BEVs, and made in Europe. And that hopefully will help BEVs to cross the ultimate frontier, which is small, cheap cars here. Because what we're seeing is that on the mid-size segment, everything is being electrified quite fast. Then on the compact segment, there is some electrification, but not that significant. And then if you go downwards, the electrification rates get smaller and smaller. So if we have a compact e car category which has less requirements regarding safety, it could make them cheaper and more attractive for buyers, and they will buy more BVs.
Interesting. Steve, you want to jump in? Look like
Now, the news that came out last week was the new Renault Twingo EV, which is just an adorable little car. I mean, the emphasis is it's a little car, but from what little experience I've had of driving in Europe, there's a lot of little cars on the road, and most of them would not appeal to U.S. drivers or Canadian drivers. But the situation in Europe, particularly with the congestion in the cities, the smaller cars are perfectly acceptable. Um, and I wrote a story about the Twingo EV, and in addition to the fact that it's just too cute, it also scheduled to start at under 20,000 euros, which um, you a lifetime ago, I used to be involved with selling Saturns, 30 years ago, actually. And they had a car that initially started at 89.99, and it was a very basic car. It didn't have many amenities. Air conditioning was an option. The mirror on the passenger side was an option. But I know somebody that drove one for 220,000 miles and absolutely loved the car. Um, the only thing that the Europeans have been making these relatively small cars for generations, and the only thing I don't know is anybody making any money on them, or is this just a market share thing that they feel they have to do, even if it's a loss leader? Jose, you might be able to respond better than that because you're in Europe and I'm not.
Yeah, the problem is to make money. And what happened in the past was that a lot of the OEMs in Europe basically neglected the city car segment, and they left the Korean makers like Hyundai, Kia, etc., to take over that part of the segment. So now, if you look just at BEV city cars, apart from the Twingo, which is now starting, you had the Fiat 500, which is adorable. It's very good, good specs, but it's quite expensive for the car. So currently, the best-selling BEV in the city car segment is a Chinese car here in Europe, the Leap motor. So uh, I hope that the Renault Twingo signs a change in the mindset of OEMs here, and that Stellantis might uh, refresh the Fiat 500 to make it much cheaper. And the German OEMs also launched their city cars at a cheap price, but with interesting specs. Volkswagen has promised a city car in 2027, costing the same as the Renault Twingo. So that is possible. Again, let's see how they will be received by the public. But yeah, they need to react, or else they will lose that segment to other brands that are not from Europe.
I just want to interject with a couple things before going to Larry. So, one, I think we shout out to our colleague Martin Winkhausen because he's been waiting for that Twingo EV for years. He's been pushing for that. He used to be very bullish on Renault and Nissan and was eagerly waiting for that Twingo EV to replace the gas car he had, but he ended up having to get another EV before that because it took so long. But yeah, shout out to him. I'm sure he's happy to see it on the market. Um, I am the European market to me is quite interesting and funny because I moved to Europe in 2008, and for 11 years was living in Poland and being around Europe, different parts of Europe. And when I moved there in 2008, I felt like there was not like a single SUV, even small SUV on the roads. I don't feel like I really saw them anywhere. And they just got more and more popular over those 11 years. And by 2019, it seemed like everybody was buying these small SUVs, or you call them crossovers maybe, and they just like taken over the new car market. It felt like, I mean, not completely, but it sort of felt like the US when that happened in the US in like the 90s, I believe. Maybe, yeah. And so I'm just not really sure like what is happening here. I don't even know if I trust my own perception and yeah, memory of that. But Jose was nodding, so I think he saw something similar happening. But it just makes me wonder, like, they're not going to go to the extreme that the U.S. has gone to now, where we have everything's a behemoth, or we don't have sedans. You have a small or mid-size SUV crossover is like the smallest vehicle people get, and so I'm just curious, like where Europe goes with this, and how much that affects the EV market, and how much that matters. But you do, of course, all over Europe see a lot more small cars, smaller cheap cars make the market much more accessible to people who would otherwise take public transit, or have to buy an older used car, and they just make sense for the small, narrow streets of many European cities. I much prefer to drive a small vehicle in Europe than a big one. I never want to be driving big vehicles in Europe. It's a nightmare. But yeah, well, with the cost, like the cost drops of batteries that we talked about in the China EV sales discussion, I don't know. I'm gonna wait to chime in with my expectations for the market, but I just want to interject those two things and then let Larry come in again with what are your thoughts? What are your expectations for Europe? Or we haven't actually put out any forecasts yet, right? So we're still just discussing. So Larry, go ahead.
So I think there are a few things going on with Europe. We say Europe is a whole, but they're dramatically different markets from the north, with you're looking at Scandinavia, and then you have Germany and France. And then you get into the more southern, like Portugal, which is one of my favorite countries, and Italy and Greece. And you get in some of those more southern parts of the continent, and they have much different markets. So you're reaching saturation levels up in Scandinavia pretty quickly, where you aren't going to see that much growth because it's almost all of the market, and you're really only addressing edge cases at this stage. So you're getting that leveling off of the S curve. Germany and France are kind of in that should be in the middle of the S curve, but there have been some policy shifts that I think are going to slow that more than would naturally happen if the previous policies were kept in place. One of the big drivers for Europe overall is the fact that only roughly 40% of all cars are purchased by individuals, and the majority are either purchased for leasing, rental, or corporate fleets, and a lot of them for what's called a company car. So you have corporations making decisions on which kinds of vehicles are being made available for people to drive, making up the majority of the market. And we've seen some shifts happen in Europe. The European Parliament just voted to water down all their ESG reporting requirements. So if I'm a corporation, I'm looking at motivations to select cars that are available to people. Now I'm not so concerned with trying to align, get my carbon CO2 emissions down. I think that also kind of distorted the market with PHEVs, where people were getting fuel subsidies a lot of the time, but had the PHEV made available, but that wasn't necessarily what they would choose as their private vehicle, and that kind of distorted the market in terms of usage patterns within Europe. So I think that company car situation is going to be a challenge overall within Germany. We've seen a few rollbacks I've been following COP30, and it seems like Europe's in a tight spot where they still want to pursue climate goals, but they also want to stay aligned with the US, and they are reluctant to get aligned with China, whereas you're seeing very kind of gung-ho kind of from the global south in terms of wanting to approach this. The other thing that you have going on with Germany, which is the largest market, is that you have a rapidly aging population, or let's say rapidly relative to, some of the other countries. And the bulk of the population's in that, 55 to 65, which is really the peak buying age. The long-term growth potential for vehicle purchases in a developed market where you aren't adding for a developed market, it doesn't show a lot of demographic, growth potential overall for their car market in the near term. So that's going to kind of level that off. I do expect faster growth in, the Portugals and the Spains and the Greeces. They are starting from a lower baseline, and that will drive them above that baseline relatively fast. So I think we're going to see a lot there. You also have much closer alignment to China in those markets. So with those markets, having that access to China, that's going to make some moves. You're also seeing a lot of changes within companies. We mentioned Renault earlier. Renault just canceled their engine project with Valeo, and they're realigning with a Chinese supplier. They have a name too. They're also saying that their next generation platform will accommodate PHEVs, which makes me think that their PHEV engine supplier, Geely, would be the natural choice for them to align with. So I have a feeling that we're going to hear some kind of announcement relatively soon in terms of Renault Geely partnership, whether that's technology or, whatnot. You have Leap Motor, Leap Motor as a solid, good selling small vehicle. They are also aligned with Stellantis. So we could be seeing some more sharing going on there. You have a massive amount of production capacity being built in Europe by Chinese companies. So I think you're going to see long-term growth, and I think that you're going to see a blurring of the lines between what is Chinese and what is European. And that's the companies where that blurring happens is where you're going to see the growth. But policy alignment is going to be the big question mark in terms of does Europe go more with the US, which is really fighting against some of the climate change initiatives, or do they kind of stay their own path, which will naturally have them become more aligned with China, which is supplying a lot of the technology. So, Europe is, some places are going to see a lot of growth. Some places are going to see little growth, and some places are, going to be stagnant. It's, where that balances out, I think it's going to be tough to tell.
Yeah.
Larry,
So
I have a question, and I don't know the answer, and I'm sure that Jose can enlighten me. And somebody mentioned earlier that the electricity prices in China are quite low, which make EVs more attractive. I am under the impression that the prices for electricity in Europe tend to be fairly high, which works against the adoption of EVs. Jose, is that correct?
Yeah, but as Larry said, Europe is not
It
one
depends.
country, it's a mosaic. So you can say that, for example, for Portugal and Spain, the prices are pretty good, like 15 cents. But as you go east, Germany has very expensive prices, for example. So each country has its own reality. Just a small other illustration about how things are in Europe regarding the car industry.
but
For
before that,
example,
on the pricing, but you also have to compare the electricity pricing to the price of petrol or gas. And
right,
so the price of petrol is also very high in Europe. So
yeah,
it's not like petrol is cheap like in the US, but electricity is high. It's like they're both high. So
Yeah,
yeah,
the differentials are, like, to Jose's point, though, they're much larger in like Spain and Portugal, where, electricity is much less. But when you're paying 45 cents per kilowatt hour, you'd have to have really expensive gasoline to compensate for that. Yeah, so there are definite differences between countries within Europe in terms of what that differential is. I made a spreadsheet comparing it, and you can pretty much plot where the kind of rapid growth has been happening lately based off of that differential between electricity and gasoline price. It's a fascinating factor, and I think you're really smart to bring that up, Stu.
Yeah, because for example, as I was saying, in Portugal you can pay 15 cents, but then in other countries you pay 3 times more. So if you spend two euros per 100 kilometers in Portugal, if you charge at home, the same car doing the same kilometers elsewhere will spend 6 euros. So that's a big difference. But what I was going to say also regarding the tastes of cars in Europe is that, for example, in October, the best-selling EV in Europe will be the Skoda Elrock. And the Skoda Elrock is that compact crossover that fits everyone in Europe. It's not too big for Southern Europeans, and it's not too small for Northern Europeans. So it's that perfect size where the Volkswagen Golf used to be, where it fits all. So what is normal in Europe for a best-selling car is to be like a compact car or a compact crossover. So city cars will be popular in the south, but they won't be in the north. Mid-size cars or full-size cars will be popular in the north, but not in the south.
It's funny. I think for 2 or 3 weeks, I've had an article in drafts that I need to finally get to that showed that it was part of a long Volkswagen Group quarterly report, but the share of Skoda's sales that were electric jumped from 11% to 24% year over year. I think that's the biggest I've seen for any legacy automaker this year. So more than doubled their share that's coming from electrics. So the last final point on Europe before we make our projections. I'm surprised nobody's brought up the elephant in the room, which was that the CO2 fleet requirements that Europe has had in place that's driven EV adoption, EV sales, not because people don't want EVs, but because automakers won't sell you EVs unless they're required to, which has been something that has been, I remember a conference in Vancouver in 2013 where researchers from Simon Fraser University were making the point that incentives will never be enough, that you have to make automakers sell EVs or they won't do it. So that's always been the case, and that's been the case in Europe. So the situation in Europe was they had a 2025 requirement that they had to hit, or they had to pay fines, or they had to buy credits from companies like BYD or Tesla. And for whatever reason, the auto industry got Europe to extend that where the requirement is still there, but they don't have to meet it until 2028, if I remember correctly, averaged out across that time frame, if I understood correctly.
I think it's the end of 27.
Oh, the end of 27. I was wondering. Okay, so end of 27. So instead of having to do it within 1 year, they had like a 3-year runway to get to the levels required. And that the funny thing, quote funny, which Transport and Environment pointed out very well earlier in the year, is that automakers basically seemed like they were doing fine, and they would have been fine on track to meet those requirements in 2025 at the beginning of the year. They were complaining they couldn't meet the targets, but they were selling enough EVs that they were on track to most of them to meet the targets. But then as soon as they got the legislation through, as soon as they got the EU to agree to this around the middle, going into the summer, going into the middle of the year, the growth in EVs sort of like tapered off a bit because they didn't have to sprint to meet these requirements anymore. So that's sort of held back growth this year compared to the previous few years in Europe. But presumably, and I think you guys can talk to it more intelligently than me, presumably the pressure of meeting those targets is ramping up enough that next year they will be trying significantly harder to produce and sell EVs, and benefiting from the learning curve of batteries, battery costs coming down, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe tariff wars even coming to a close. Who knows? We can all dream. But yeah, the situation with that in mind, I think I want to get your feedback before I make any forecast. But I think we're expecting more effort from automakers next year, right?
Yep,
Or
I agree
not
with you.
yet.
No,
Yeah.
yeah, for sure. That's why I said that 26 and 27 will be relatively easy to forecast because they have targets to fulfill. Afterwards, you don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah, I heard that, and I thought, it was like, do I have my date wrong? Is it 2027, not 2028? So that makes sense. So all right, let's give our forecast. We'll start. I'll go ahead and I'll let no. Give us the baseline again. Where are we, Jose? We're at
So 18, 20,
18%.
18 BVs, 27 plug-in, which means 18 BV and 9 PHEV.
Okay. Is anyone brave enough, ready to chime in with a 2026 forecast?
Sure. I got nothing to lose. I would say that Jose is probably accurate and might be a little on the high side. I have a sense that the European political forces are aligning uh, with the waves coming across the Atlantic from the U.S. and being much more timid in their approach to addressing the reason why we have EVs in the first place. And I think that Europe is not going to show a tremendous amount of growth, probably for the next 2 years. So I think Jose is probably right on, or perhaps a little high.
But Jose, you didn't give a forecast, did you?
So 23 for BVs
Oh, you did.
and 35 for plugins. So
Oh, you did
23
give it.
BVs and then 12 or 13 for plug-in hybrids.
So you're going from 18 to 23
Yeah,
and
and
9.
9 to 13, for example.
So together, yeah, right. I remember that now. Together, we're at 38% plug-in
And
vehicle.
one thing about PHEVs, why I'm adding PHEVs so much. So
The
the
Chinese
tariffs over Chinese
Chinese are
OEMs
coming.
are no. The Chinese are already here. But the thing is, the tariffs over Chinese cars are to BVs, not PHEVs. So what I think will happen next year will be like all the Chinese coming, all of a sudden making multiple launches of PHEVs here. And there it will be interesting to see the reaction of local OEMs. Will they play game with them and lower prices, increase specs, or will they just give away the PHEV market to the Chinese?
Am I up?
Yeah, I realized I didn't chime in, but I'm gonna go with Jose. I don't want to be too brave here and come up with something else. I think you've got the best pulse of the market, and that seems like solid growth. So we go with 23% BEVs, 13% plug-in hybrids. Larry,
I think
you gonna
that
diverge?
no, I think that sounds pretty much right on. I think that we will see a divergence in who is placing where on the charts. I think that, to Jose's point on PHEVs, we could see very solid growth, not only because of the tariff situation, but because right now Europe's not getting the most advanced PHEVs yet. You have a Song Plus that is on an older version of the existing Song Plus, which is being phased out completely in China, and that's the top-selling PHEV in the continent. So there are better PHEVs on the horizon. You have the cost structure where if you compare a Song Plus to, or a CLU, I guess it's called there. If you
Yeah.
compare a CLU to a RAV4 or a comparable ICE or a hybrid vehicle, it's at parity or slightly below. I think that price parity, you could see a lot more product at price parity with ICE, and that could drive a lot of sales, especially in the private market, as well as in the corporate fleets. I have mixed feelings on BEV. I think we might be in a bit of a transition year next year. I think that long-term growth is going to be has potentially a little bit more strength behind it. But you do have a lot of production capacity being built out in Europe. And I think you're going to see a ramp of EVs made in Hungary and Turkey, starting to increase the overall sales on the continent. Whether or not that has a big impact in 26 or 27 is the big question. But I think I'll go for 22-14. So like 1 point less on BEVs. I think that based off some of the political headwinds that you're running into right now, that could slow growth overall. But I think that, Jose's on the right path.
So you did 1 point less on
On
BEVs and
BEV.
1 point less on 1 point more on PHEVs, right? So same
Yeah,
38.
1 point more on yeah, roughly. So 37. 37's my lucky number, so.
Okay, 37. Yeah. So going to 2030, this is, picking a lottery number basically, but I just wanted to bring up one more factor, which is that it's unfortunate and it's like something we probably don't want to think or talk too much about, but while the U.S. has, quote, led the way in its extreme shift to the right with the Trump administration, certain elements of that, Europe has actually been having similar trends going on, similar pull from the right, anti-immigration trends especially, and you sort of like fended them off so far, but they've gotten stronger and more louder. And so there is two concerns here. One is power could shift in Europe in the coming years, and they could just throw pike bombs into all these policies like has happened in the US. So we don't really know if it's as stable and strong and consistent with these policies as we'd hope. And the second part of that is that while it seems like there's certain like anti-immigrant and sort of like social media driven chaos campaigns against certain elements of society that have driven a lot of this, it seems like politicians on the left have tried to like moderate or have tried to like water down their commitments on all kinds of issues to try to appease certain voters or to try to like not lose their power. And my concern is that that's happening, as Larry mentioned with the ESG thing. My concern is that that's happening with climate and clean tech policies that aren't even really at the center of these kind of discussions and controversies, debates, but are taking the hit. I mean, in the U.S., it is a big, we're sort of like, we are a petro state like Russia or Saudi Arabia, and whenever the Republicans are in power, they are doing the bidding of the oil and gas and coal industries. Like that's what they do. They're heavily funded by them. So it's like, that's a clear part of what they are about on the right here. That's not necessarily what the right is about or what they care as much about in Europe. But like I said, I feel like there might be like, they might kind of make concessions or try to water down their policies to seem less left. And I don't really think it makes sense. I don't think it helps, but I do think it happens. So yeah, my concern looking into 2030 is like, well, where is Europe in 2030? Like, where is it in 2027? Where is it in 2028? And I don't think anybody really knows. Like, I mean, I don't think anyone really has a strong sense. I mean, like of course everyone's going to have different beliefs, but it's gotten real murky in Europe, and it's quite concerning. So, yeah, that's my preface for 2030. Nonetheless, with technology advancements and hoping that things stay pretty stable there, I am going to say 2030. Again, that gives us 5 full years. If anyone wants to beat me to it, you can. I'm thinking still what I want to guess for 2030. I keep going towards. No, that's too little. Ugh. I keep thinking 60%, but I feel like that's too pessimistic. But at the same time, I don't know what's around the corner. I'm going to go 50% BEVs, 70% plug-in vehicles.
Yeah.
I don't feel like I'm right either, but that's what I'm going with. That's what I'm going with.
I hope you're right, but I am not as optimistic. I'm seeing 40% BEVs and 17% plug-ins for a total of 57% by 2030.
I was thinking 60% for plug-in vehicles overall, but I keep feeling like we're underestimating how long it is till 2030 and how much the technology curves will improve in 5 years. But I'm fine though. I was leaning towards 60%. So you've got 57% combined, 40 and 17, right?
I actually think we'd be lucky to get there because the signals that are coming out of Europe are, as you mentioned, Zach, they're pulling back on a lot of their flowery pronouncements about they're going to do this, that, and the other thing because they have to, in order to lead, first you have to get elected, and the forces that have taken over the United States are not limited to our shores; they're everywhere. So I think outside of China, I think that in Europe and the U.S., we're going to see lower electric vehicle sales of all types than we had hoped for. What we are probably going to see is much greater sales of electric vehicles in um, countries that we don't normally talk about. But as a group, they make up a huge part of the new car market. And I think it's the countries we don't talk about that are going to lead the way because they're the ones that are at COP30 right now, and they are screaming that no one is listening and no one is paying attention, but they are. What I just read yesterday, gosh, I wish my brain would work better than it does, but there was a country in Africa that banned the sale of gasoline-powered cars last year.
Ethiopia.
Ethiopia, and that's a straw in the wind. That indicates something that I don't think a lot of people are paying attention to. I can see a lot of countries doing something like Ethiopia and saying, we don't really care what the U.S. and what the Europe is doing. We have to take care of ourselves. And the way we're going to do that is we are going to take direct, concerted action to address climate change. And if the rest of you don't want to join us, that's up to you, but we're going to do it anyway. That's my prediction.
And turn to Mother China or Mother BYD.
Exactly.
Larry, what's your thought?
I mean, I think Steve is kind of right on in terms of, that happening. I had a conversation with a friend from Ghana yesterday, a long conversation in like, they're looking for what's going to get them to the next stage of development. Ghana also eliminated all of their tariffs on, from what he said on EVs. A number of African countries are looking at that. They're trying to bring in manufacturing. And due to the proximity to Europe, I think that companies that have a strong presence in Africa, which is going to be the growth market, not necessarily where the sales are now, but where the growth market is, but countries that are pursuing that are going to build up more scale in EVs. And those alignments are going to help drive both the European market and the overall alignment. China clearly is kind of driving a lot of that. If you look at where the Belt and Road Initiative, it's basically the south of Europe, Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and almost all of Africa. And that's going to see much faster growth, I think, than what you're looking at in terms of Germany. If you look at the overall sales numbers, you have to look at the demographics by country, and, we might be seeing challenges, maybe not in 5 years, but in 10 years, just in terms of overall demographics driving sales and who is buying cars and wealth distributions based off ages. And, when people retire, they aren't getting their company car anymore. So how does that all play in? I think that, I'm kind of, maybe even more pessimistic than Steve here is. It'll depend.
Oh, no.
No, it'll depend
I
highly.
wasn't sure that was possible.
It'll depend highly on how things realign. If Trump keeps being as confrontational as he is, we may see a global realignment and the overall global shift away from the U.S., which is driving a lot of these changes. Like, they are directly credited for driving the elimination of the ESG initiatives in the European Parliament. It's because of pressure from the U.S. If Europe gets over some of their kind of fears of the other, the immigrants that they're talking about are coming from a lot of these countries that are also the potential growth countries for EVs in the global south. I think it could be better, but, I don't know. I'm thinking like maybe 55% combined. Let's say 45, 10, maybe a little bit more for PHEVs. I feel like, based off where we are now, if we have political shifts in the realignment, which could either be due to efforts to realign to the countries that are leading in EVs, or a disalignment with the countries that are pushing back, that could change, and that could change pretty rapidly.
All right. So you got 45, 55 combined.
Yeah.
Jose, final word.
Okay. I have to make some assumptions here, because assuming everything is as it is right now, so the policies stay until 2035, etc., I would say 60% BEV, and then, or no, 50% BEV, like 80% 50% BEV, 30% PHEV, then 80% in 2030.
All right.
But that is being the optimistic.
That's almost mine.
But yeah, that's the optimistic in me. But assuming that politics won't go as expected, I have to highlight another thing here. And this is a big difference regarding the US. So we allowed Chinese EVs here, and that makes a gigantic difference. And I will give you two numbers just to have an idea. Albania now is at over 50% share of EVs. Ukraine is at 30% BEV share right now. Those aren't countries that are wealthy. One of them is even at war. Yet, BEVs and plug-in hybrids are growing a lot. And what's the secret there? China. For example, in Albania, BYD is by far the best-selling brand in the overall market. In Ukraine, BYD is also kicking out Toyota as the best-selling brand. So what's happening is that even if there are no policies to support, even if there's no incentives, etc., if you allow the Chinese OEMs to take over the market, as these markets are doing, the EV share will jump anyway. Thing is, and this is what's a lot of the policies happening, is people want to save the European car industry. That's why there are tariffs on BEVs, for example. But imagine that different politicians have different ideas. One of the things I'm hearing a lot about those kind of right-wing politicians is that they don't like incentives on any BVs, etc., but they are not also pro tariffs. So they like the free market, pure and simple. So if the incentives are removed for BVs, but if basically there's no tariffs, the Chinese will come in, and then European car makers will have a lot to think about. So either they find this opportunity to modernize, get into the EV competition as a leader, and I think some of them are doing, like BMW with the new iX3, which are interesting cars by themselves. Or if the future is just, oh, we will continue to sell petrol cars and diesel cars, the Chinese will basically take over the market. And also a final thought on the patchwork that is Europe. So in many countries, we have 5% plug-in share or 10% plug-in share. So there's a long way to go, but it's not only Norway. Denmark is at 70% BEV share right now. So in some countries, the transition will happen anyway. Of course, the question mark is, in those markets that are below, who will win those markets?
So you're sticking
European
with
car
50
makers,
plus 30 for
Chinese?
now, with a big caveat.
With a big caveat, a very big caveat.
All right. Well, if you guys enjoyed this discussion, be sure to like and subscribe and hype us and all that stuff down below. Also, be sure to check out the China EV sales forecast discussion and the US one, which we'll be doing in a moment in a separate video. But yes, definitely a lot of expert commentary here. I really appreciate all of you bringing your expertise to the discussion. I think everybody made everyone here in the room a bit smarter today. So thank you, and thank you to everyone for listening, subscribing, and contributing monthly to support Clean Technica. Thank you.